Welcome to the Partardez channel. Today we explain Prophets Kings 2, chapter 21 in a clear and simple way, step by step. I am literally so thrilled you're tuning in because, well, this chapter, it is absolutely one of the most dramatic, pivotal turning points in the entire history of the kings of Judah. We're going to go right into the text, verse by verse, figuring out exactly what goes down, why it happens, and what it all actually means. So let's jump right in.
Here is our pedagogical roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the introduction and context, then move into Manasseh's idolatry and sins, followed by God's judgment on Judah. After that, we'll cover Amon's reign and fall, break down key ideas and lessons, and wrap it all up with a chapter recap and conclusion.
Section 1, Introduction and Context, the Succession of Manasseh.
All right, so setting the scene on our timeline here, the chapter opens with Manasseh becoming king. And get this, he's only 12 years old. Just pause and imagine that for a second. Being handed the absolute rule of an entire nation at 12. He's succeeding his father, Hezekiah. Now, the text makes a really crucial point right off the bat. Hezekiah was a righteous king who actively destroyed idol worship. But Manasseh, he takes power as a literal child and ends up ruling for a massive 55 years in Jerusalem. That's a huge reign, half a century to shape the nation. But verse 2 explicitly states, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He actively followed the detestable practices of the nations God had previously driven out of the land. So right out of the gate, he chooses a deeply, deeply evil path.
Section 2. Manasseh's idolatry and sins, reversing the righteousness.
Starting in verse 3, the text doesn't hold back. It gives us this deliberate step-by-step account of Manasseh's profound descent into idolatry. The big takeaway here is that Manasseh systematically undoes his father's entire legacy. Verse 3 tells us he rebuilt the high places. Now, these were those unauthorized local shrines up on the hills that Hezekiah had explicitly smashed to centralize worship in Jerusalem. But Manasseh doesn't stop there. No, he goes further. He erects altars to Baal, a Canaanite deity, and builds an Asherah pole, doing exactly what Ahab, the notoriously wicked king of the northern kingdom, had done. He's also bowing down to all the starry hosts, literally worshiping the stars and planets. And incredibly, verse 4 says he built these pagan altars right inside the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. The audacity is just staggering.
But you guys, the text gets even darker as we move to verse 6. It details some truly horrifying practices. It explicitly states that Manasseh sacrificed his own son in the fire, or made his son pass through the fire. This isn't a metaphor, it's the tragic, literal ancient practice of child sacrifice. Alongside this, he was heavily into sorcery, divination, and consulting mediums and spiritists. These are occult practices meant to communicate with the dead or manipulate spiritual forces, which, if you remember, were strictly forbidden by the laws given to Moses. The verse basically wraps up by saying he did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. It's a total spiritual freefall. Now, looking directly at the Hebrew source text, we see his ultimate unthinkable transgression in verse 7. Manasseh actually takes the carved Asherah pole, the idol he literally just made, and places it directly into the sacred temple. The text goes completely out of its way here to remind us of what God had said to David and Solomon about this specific building. In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, will I put my name forever. Manasseh took the one place on earth dedicated exclusively to the presence of the God of Israel, and he turned it into a sanctuary for a carved pagan image. It is the ultimate betrayal. And this brilliantly illustrates the real tragedy of the whole situation. Back in verse 8, God had promised the nation ultimate security. He literally said he wouldn't cause their feet to wander from the land he gave their forefathers if they would just observe all the laws commanded by Moses. It was a simple condition. But verse 9 notes the heartbreaking reality. The people just did not listen. Instead, Manasseh seduced them. He led them so far astray that they actually did more evil than the pagan nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites even arrived. He didn't just fail as a leader, he was an active agent of unprecedented corruption.
Section 3. God's judgment on Judah, the prophetic warning.
Moving into verses 10 through 15, we finally see God's intense, devastating response to these 55 years of corruption, and he delivers it directly through his servants, the prophets. They bring a message that is entirely meant to shock the system. In verses 11 and 12, God declares that because Manasseh committed these detestable sins, acting worse than the Amorites who lived in the land before them, a total catastrophe is coming. God says, "I'm going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle." That's a profound physical description of shock and horror. The impending disaster is going to be so absolute, so terrifying, that just hearing the news will literally make your ears ring.
To really clearly explain the fascinating metaphors used in verse 13, the prophets speak of a measuring line and a plumb line. Now, in ancient construction, a measuring line makes sure things are level, right? And a plumb line checks if a wall is perfectly straight vertically. God is saying he will stretch out over Jerusalem the exact same measuring line he used against Samaria, the northern kingdom that had already been wiped out, and the plumb line used against the wicked house of King Ahab. What does this mean for us? It means God is applying the exact same strict standard of judgment. Jerusalem will be tested with the same tool, found to be completely crooked, and will face the identical standard of total ruin.
And this brings us to a chilling, truly unforgettable visual metaphor right in the middle of verse 13. The Lord says, "I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes out a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down." Just think about that imagery for a second. When you finish a meal and wipe a dish completely clean, there is literally nothing left on it. Then, to make sure it's totally empty and dry, you turn it entirely upside down. Wow. It is a terrifying promise of absolute, inescapable exile.
Verses 14 through 16 go on to explain the dire physical consequences of this judgment. God says he is going to forsake the remnant of his inheritance. They will be handed directly over to their enemies to become nothing but loot and plunder. And verse 16 adds a vital, brutal detail about why this judgment is so exceptionally severe. It wasn't just private religious idolatry. Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he literally filled Jerusalem from end to end. The complete abandonment of God's law led directly to a complete breakdown of human morality and justice. Violence just filled the streets.
Section 4. Amon's reign and fall, a brief echo of evil.
In verse 18, the incredibly long reign of Manasseh finally ends. He dies, is buried in his palace garden, the Garden of Uzzah, and passes the crown to his son Amon, opening a brief, chaotic new chapter. Amon takes power at the age of 22. But unlike his father's massive 55-year run, Amon's reign is a blip. It's incredibly brief. He manages to hold the throne in Jerusalem for a mere 2 years.
Now you might be thinking, okay, maybe a new generation will bring reform, especially with those terrifying prophetic warnings of total destruction hanging over the city, right? But verses 20 through 22 tell us otherwise. Instead of reversing course, Amon fully replicates his father's sins. He walked in all the ways of his father, worshipped the exact same idols, and bowed down to them. He entirely forsook the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and just flat out refused to walk in the right path. He doubled down on the corruption. Because of this massive instability, Amon's short rule ends violently, as we see in verses 23 and 24. First, his own royal officials conspire against him. Second, they assassinate the king right inside his own palace. But then, a third step happens. The regular citizens, referred to as the people of the land, they rise up. They execute all the officials who plotted against Amon. Finally, step 4, the people crown Amon's son, Josiah, taking control of the royal succession to ensure the line of David continues. It's just a whirlwind of chaos. Section 5, Key Ideas and Lessons, Synthesizing the Text. All right, having walked through the historical, step-by-step narrative of chapter 21, let's pivot to the thematic and practical life lessons here. What are we supposed to take away from these super dark historical records? Well, first, the chapter presents a stark, undeniable contrast. On one side, we have the path of Moses, clearly outlined back in verse 8. Security, stability, and roots in the land, provided the people keep the ethical and spiritual laws. On the exact opposite side, we have the path of Manasseh, utter national collapse, moral decay, the shedding of innocent blood, and eventual exile brought on by idolatry. The text wants us to clearly see that abandoning foundational ethical truth doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to the wiping of the dish, total ruin.
From a practical standpoint, the plain text teaches us so much about the immense, heavy burden of leadership. One leader, Manasseh, was able to seduce an entire nation to do worse evil than the ancient pagan tribes. We see the horrific ripple effect of departing from core moral values. It starts with building an altar, moves into the temple, and ends with innocent blood filling the streets from end to end. Furthermore, we see the generational compounding of bad decisions. Amon watched his father's life, and instead of learning from it, he just simply repeated it. Poor leadership doesn't just damage the present, it deeply infects the future.
Section 6. Chapter Recap and Conclusion. Reviewing Chapter 21. Let's do a quick wrap-up of the chronological movements we explored today. First, we begin with Manasseh taking the throne at age 12 and plunging Judah into 55 years of unprecedented, systematic idolatry and violence. Second, we heard God's chilling decree through the prophets, absolute ruin measured by a plumb line, and exile likened to wiping a dish completely clean. Third, we saw Amon's brief, stubborn 2-year echo of his father's evil. And finally, we witnessed the chaotic palace assassination and the installation of a new king, Josiah.
And that leaves us with a profound, super provocative final thought. The chapter ends with Josiah taking the throne, but the spiritual and moral infrastructure of the nation is completely destroyed. So how can the newly crowned Josiah possibly navigate, let alone repair, a nation so deeply entrenched in darkness for almost 60 years? It is a cliffhanger of massive proportions that sets the stage for absolutely everything that follows.
Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.